The Crown Tundra expansion for Pokemon Sword was released in October of 2020 and served as the final big DLC drop for the 8th generation of Pokemon. After playing through and critiquing both the base game as well as the Isle of Armor expansion, it's now time for me to share my thoughts on the final piece of content for Pokemon Sword and Shield. If you haven't already watched my videos on Pokemon Sword and the Isle of Armor DLC, I suggest checking those out before proceeding with this one. This video will be structured in the same format as the Isle of Armor video. I'll be playing through the DLC once and offering my thoughts on various components of the expansion and the series as they arise. As I wrapped up my time in the Isle of Armor, I gave myself about a month away from the game before beginning to prep for this video and heading to Galar's southernmost area to explore the Crown Tundra. Going in, I hoped only to see Game Freak expand on what they had done in the Isle of Armor. In other words, I wanted them to expand on the wild area conceptually and send this version of the concept off on the right note. I also wanted them to introduce new characters with more captivating mini-adventures to embark on, and I wanted to leave this DLC feeling like my money had been well spent. So, how did things go? Well, let's find out. Welcome to my critique/commentary on Pokemon Sword's Crown Tundra DLC. Much like in the Isle of Armor expansion, things in the Crown Tundra kick off by venturing to a new land, having your Pokédex upgraded, and meeting a powerful new trainer who will help in shaping the experience. Here we have Peony, a gym leader of Galar, and his daughter Peonia, or better known as Nia. This familiar setup gave me hope for what was to come, because going in, I was worried that the Crown Tundra would shy away from the story elements found in the Isle of Armor and instead focus heavily on gameplay additions, which, as we know, have always proven to be hit or miss throughout the series' history. Peony himself is full of life and energy, and he's here in the Crown Tundra for what he hopes will be a good bonding experience for him and his daughter. The problem is that Nia, or Naya, I guess it could be pronounced that way too, is reaching that age where she no longer wants to hang out with her father. I really thought this divide might end up being one of the major plot threads throughout this DLC, but it really never becomes anything more than this divide, so it's kind of weird to even establish it. As a quick note on character design though, I like Peony's design, although I don't think it does enough to emphasize his fixation on the Steel typing. To this day, none of the Steel-type gym leaders have really sold me on their passion for the typing, and that remains true here. Still, he does look decent. Naya, on the other hand, is hardly a step above your average schoolgirl trainer that you'd find inhabiting the educational buildings on early routes in most Pokemon games. She feels like a rough draft that's incomplete, and to me, her design really needed more time. Also, both the father and daughter have this weird obsession with winking, which I don't think translates well into this animation style. Moving on, we have a fight to engage with, and our battle with Peony is a lot better than our first encounter with Clara, and that's because he uses some fully evolved Pokemon. I mentioned in the previous video that Clara having first stage evolutions in our first battle felt insulting to my fully evolved team. There was no way she could stand a chance, and while Peony did fall just as quickly, at least his Caparaja and Aggron were more intimidating given their both final forms. I would have liked to see him have one more Pokemon though, perhaps one that's able to resist super effective fighting moves like Bronzong, but that's probably a nitpick. Regardless, it's about as good as an intro to a new character as we could have expected. I like Peony. but Naya, just okay. Following this encounter, we're set free in the Crown Tundra to explore, but unlike my time in the Isle of Armor, I felt compelled to pursue the story here immediately. In the near distance lies a cave called the Max Lair, which represents a massive new feature introduced in this DLC. Upon arrival, we learn that Nia has ventured deep into the cave and will have to take a run through it in order to find her. Peony is adamant about rushing in after her, but the scientist there explains to us that it's dangerous, given that these layers are labyrinthian and contain very powerful Pokemon, all of whom are Dynamaxed. At this point, I felt compelled to try a couple of these runs in order to form a first impression of this massive new addition. I'll share more of my complaints about the Max Layers later in this video, but for now, I can at least explain the setup of them. When entering a Max Lair, the player will be asked to select one of 3 random Pokemon to start their run with. These Pokemon appear to be randomly generated with various movesets, but your best option is usually the one with the most type-varied damage attacks. This ensures that you can hit hard with Dynamax moves and cover as many bases as possible as you move through the lair. With your partner selected, you enter the cavern and are immediately met with a decision. Choose a path to venture down. You're told what type of Pokemon you'll be facing depending on the path you choose, and if you squint, you might be able to make out the outline of the actual Pokemon in order to identify it. After choosing your path, you'll enter battle against the Dynamax Pokemon alongside of 3 other trainers who are either computer AI or human friends if you have the Nintendo Online Pass. I've played the entire game offline and continued to do so for this video, meaning I can't comment on the online functionality of it. Anyway, you battle the Pokemon until the party loses, wins, or is swept out of the den, which counts as a loss. If you defeat the Pokemon, you're given a chance to capture it with an additional option to replace your current Pokemon with that new one. Your health doesn't automatically refill after each battle, so swapping may prove useful, especially if it might mean gaining a new type advantage for the upcoming battles. That's right, when you first enter the dungeon, you get a preview of what's to come, and you can scroll to see what lies ahead. Advantageous players will take note of the easiest path to victory, as well as the capabilities and typings of the legendary Pokemon that awaits at the end. I should also note that if you decline to catch or exchange the Pokemon you just battled, one of your teammates is given the option to do so, and normally the computer AI will take that new Pokemon. Following the first battle, you'll take on 2 more in a similar setup. You'll choose a path, venture down it, defeat and catch Dynamax Pokemon, and so on and so forth. There's also a few other elements of randomness thrown in for good measure, like researchers who will exchange your Pokemon for an unknown Pokemon or berries that can be used to heal up your squad. It all culminates in a showdown against a legendary Pokemon, Suicune on my first and second attempts, and Rayquaza on my third. After defeating the legendary, you're able to capture it, but you're only allowed to keep 1 Pokemon that you caught during the entire run. This remains true even if you lose at any point during the run. You'll get the option to keep 1 of the Pokemon you've caught. If you're fond of the legendary you encountered, you're also able to save it to a slot so that you can attempt to catch it again upon failure. In other words, I lost to Suicune on my first run, and I love that Pokemon. It's one of my favorite legendaries of all time, so I decided to save it to a slot so that I could pursue him again. I didn't manage to catch him on the second run either though, and ended up attempting a new run in which I found Rayquaza. And I failed to catch him too, but I saved his slot as well to be attempted later. I'm not sure how many slots are available, but I really hope it's unlimited. This at least ensures that the player can get multiple attempts at some of their favorite legendaries, which is a nice consideration, considering each encounter is selected randomly. So that's pretty much the overall setup of these max layers, and to be honest with you, I was instantly turned off by the concept of them, and I find their inclusion to be a complete waste of the player's time. The two major issues are the insane amounts of randomness involved, as well as the time sink that the game demands of you if you want to catch them all. But for now, that's just a little tease for you. I'll share more thoughts on the max layers later, but after experiencing 3, I was not impressed and opted to push onward. After your first run through the max layer, you'll encounter Naya regardless of whether you win or lose. She will go on a teenage rant about how her father embarrasses her and how she just wants to go alone through the max layer. She asks you to take her spot on the great father-daughter tour of the Crown Tundra, and Peony eventually comes to agree to this proposition out of fear of upsetting his daughter. So I guess that divide between them does end up serving a purpose. It allows the player to slot into her role. It's a good enough excuse to guide the player through the DLC's offerings. From here, I venture towards Freezington, which is one of the worst town names in the series' history. But don't be fooled, as this unassuming town will be our base of operations for the rest of the game. After chatting up the locals, Peony directs us to his house, where he puts us in charge of a task force dedicated to uncovering the mysteries surrounding the Crown Tundra. A majority of this DLC's offerings are centered on investigating 3 legends. One about the legendary birds Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno. One about the regis, including some new ones. And finally, one on the new legendary Pokemon, Calyrex. I decided to tackle this last legendary first, which ended up being the right choice, considering the start point for this story event is found right here. Literally. Peony has stolen a portion of the Calyrex statue and is using it as a pillow, but restoring the monument awakens Calyrex, who communes with the player. After defeating it in battle, Calyrex does something rather cool. It takes over the body of Peony and uses him as a medium to discuss its current status. It admires our kindness for restoring its statue, and recruits us in helping the villagers rekindle their belief in this all-powerful Pokemon. After some pointless back and forth walking between Calyrex and the villagers, we're sent out into the Crown Tundra proper to find the mayor. Calyrex believes that if we can track down his loyal steed, then some of his power may return, which might aid in reigniting the villagers' passion for their king of the bountiful harvest. And apparently, the mayor has information about this other Pokemon, so we head out in search of him. I decided that before continuing this quest, I'd take some time to explore the Crown Tundra, much in the same way that I had after completing the first trial in the Isle of Armor. I wanted to get my bearings and see how this wild area compared to the base games, as well as the Isles, to make note of any improvements or steps back. After spending about an hour just walking around and exploring the Crown Tundra, I just gotta come out and say it. This is the best wild area offered throughout Sword and Shield, and I think it can be narrowed down to 3 reasons. Number 1. There's a commitment to presenting varied biomes that don't sacrifice geographical believability. Number 2, there's environmental details, big and small, that aid in the mystery vibe offered by the story. And number 3, there's a much greater emphasis on verticality, which is more realistic. So let's start with that first part. The original wild area, as I mentioned in the previous video, felt kinda like a caged exhibit at the zoo. There were plenty of Pokemon defined, but Game Freak really struggled in creating realistic transitions between the biomes. Most of the base game's wild area felt flat and samey, but the more distinct sections also suffered because they hardly transitioned in seamlessly. This improved in the Isle of Armor, where there were tons of biomes that transitioned into one another well enough, save for a few exceptions. The Isle of Armor had a swamp, it had lowlands, it had vast oceans, it had rolling hills, it had caverns, it had a hidden desert, and more. The variety was nice, but it was hard to believe a landmass like this could actually exist without some crazy weather patterns wreaking havoc in Galar. The Crown Tundra is exceptional though, as we get a few distinct biomes without trying to cram too much into it. There's a lot of snowy, mountainous areas that give way to some hillside forests as the elevation decreases, and finally, at the very southern part of Galar, we find a plentiful lake with a beautiful red tree taking center stage. In other words, we start on top of a mountain, and the environment gets more lush as we descend, which feels believable and varied at the same time, which is a nice touch. It easily escapes the sensation that we're in a caged exhibit, while also not throwing in too much at once. It gives me a lot of hope that Game Freak could design an entire region using this wild area setup if they're able to build biomes that transition so naturally like they have here. Second, the Crown Tundra's main plot is all about mystery, legends, and myths, and their level design here goes a long way in supporting this sort of enigmatic atmosphere. There's massive ruins built directly into the various parts of the landscape that house the regis, and getting inside will clearly require some serious critical thinking. It also won't take long for players to spot this massive red tree in the distance, which creates another moment of wonder. And this remains true for an ancient temple I uncovered at the very top of the highest point in the Crown Tundra. These were massive map-defining structures that caught my eye, but there's also a ton of smaller environmental details that lead credence to this cryptic storytelling approach. For example, one small thing, Freezington survives by growing crops, yet they're surrounded by lots of snow, which makes for an interesting thought to ponder. There's also a ton of areas that appear to be ruined towards the base of the mountain, which stirs up questions in the player's mind, like who used to live here and why do the villagers not attempt to cultivate this land? I also encountered a cemetery, which felt like a nice creepy addition to add to the mystery. And on top of that, the caverns and waterways are winding and tough to get your bearings in. It's the level design shouldering some of the responsibility in carrying forth the mystery of this land, which goes hand in hand with a story all about myths and legends. And finally, the simplest point of all, verticality. The Crown Tundra nails the sensation that we start on a mountaintop and can work our way down to the sea below. Both the Isle of Armor's wild area and that of the base game had layers to it, but neither of them can hold a candle to what we find here. The freezing slopes surrounding Freezington give way to a massive open area called the Giant's Bed, which is littered with rolling hills and dips in elevation. But the player can also uncover an additional pathway that leads back up the mountain to an ancient temple. And then, of course, they can navigate the waterways to find their way down to the mysterious tree that probably caught their eye from the get-go. This sense of verticality immediately distinguishes itself from anything we've seen from the previous wild areas. And it's for these three reasons that I must say that the Crown Tundra's wild area is easily the best we've gotten so far. It appears each iteration on this formula has improved, and this one in particular gives me a lot of confidence in Game Freak moving forward if they were to adopt this style across an entire game. And yes, I do mean that word confidence. what used to be hope is now full-on confidence. With that being said, issues still exist, but all of them are ones I've already harped on about in the previous video. You'll still find a lot of Pokemon popping into existence, which is slightly worse here given that a lot of these Pokemon are really big. Like, for example, Calyrex popping into existence 4 steps before you walk into it. It sucks. It looks stupid, and it's terrible. The bigger the Pokemon, the worse this looks. And that issue with the camera still exists. It's slightly better here, as not every single cliffside will trigger that terrible looking zoom, but still most of them did. And the one place where Game Freak still needs to do some serious work is in the design of their caves, as every single one here and in the Isle of Armor appears completely barren and leaves a lot to be desired visually. And again, I'm going through these issues quickly because I've said them before, but many of the same issues that plagued previous wild areas can also be found here. However, there are some signs of slight improvement within those missteps. Let's get back to our main quest by locating the mayor and uncovering more of the mystery surrounding Calyrex. Over the next hour or so, the player is sent on some fetch quests in order to progress the story. And perhaps fetch quest isn't the right term. It's more like, walk over here so that you can watch the next cutscene. There's a lot of talking to Calyrex, running an errand for him, and then returning to him to get the next step. It doesn't go on forever though, so it didn't really feel like a nuisance per se. The problem was that it hardly involved my team of Pokemon. You won't do a lot of battling or catching during this questline. Instead, it's mostly about triggering cutscenes until the King of Bountiful Harvests is able to reclaim his power. It made for an interesting story, but based on how I'm moving through it, you can tell it really didn't do too much to hold my interest. I said in the Isle of Armor video that I'd like to see Game Freak go further in their storytelling by utilizing specific Pokemon and using their personalities to tell cool side stories. This certainly checks that box, but there really needs to be more involvement from the player. The core mechanics of the series are kind of put to the side as excluding one wild Pokemon battle and catching Calyrex. All you really do is walk around and trigger cutscenes, which isn't engaging. There was one element of the Calyrex questline that did manage to pull me in. Giving the player the option to choose either Spectrier or Glacier as their legendary Pokemon was a worthwhile inclusion. Given the series' history, I have to imagine that Game Freak was very tempted to lock the Ghost Horse to Sword and the Ice Horse to Shield, or vice versa. However, putting the decision on the player creates a moment of pure player choice and expression, which these games do need a little bit more of. I can't imagine a world where Game Freak ever allows the player to choose which box art legendary they encounter and can catch, but it's at least nice to see it was more than just a consideration in this DLC pack with these two legendaries. I opted to go with Spectrier, and after luring it back to the ancient temple, it was time for the final showdown with Calyrex. It fuses with whichever legendary horse you chose, and it's the first time I've seen something this bold done with a Pokemon since Kyurem. Calyrex, Spectrier, and Glastrier can all be trained separate from one another. However, Calyrex can fuse with one of the horses, and upon doing so, it gains a new ability and a powerful ghost or ice type attack depending on who he's mounted. He also gains a new ability called As One, which means he has two abilities, his own innate one, as well as Spectrier's or Glastrier's. Earlier in this questline, Peony gave us a Master Ball, and I assume this is the intended time to use it. It was kind of them to give the player another, especially after most people would have used their only one by now. it makes catching Calyrex a breeze, meaning that the player isn't challenged at all during this questline. And as a side note, I think it's strange that Calyrex views himself as being all high and mighty during the questline, as he actively wants the admiration of the humans, but then he immediately abandons it to quest alongside of you. Anyway, I'm glad they went down the route that they did, as this was a cool story to experience in a Pokemon game, but its failure to attach the core mechanics to it left it feeling rather hollow. I want to feel like I'm playing through an episode of the anime when completing these mini-stories, but in this case, my lack of involvement left me feeling like I was just watching passively, and I think that's a shame. For my next outing, I figured it was time to track down the legendary birds of Kanto, who have been given Galarian forms. While out exploring earlier, I stumbled across this massive tree where Zapdos, Articuno, and Moltres battled it out before scurrying in all different directions. At the time, I learned that each bird departed for a different sector of Galar, one to the wild area, one to the Isle of Armor, and one stuck around in the Crown Tundra. I didn't realize it at the time, but this meant it was up to me to track them all down for a battle and to catch them, which was amazing. Or at least the act of running them down was. While I enjoyed the fact that these crazy strong Pokemon weren't just standing around idly in some corner of the region waiting for me like in other games, these battles really got me thinking about how difficult a time Game Freak has had in implementing legendaries into their games. Legendary Pokemon are awesome, but they create issues within the gameplay as well as the narrative. Story-wise, the legendaries of each region are said to be some of the most powerful beings within their lands. If this is the case, why are they able to be captured and controlled by the player? Like, I get it, we want the strongest Pokemon in the game for ourselves, but it creates a dissonance between gameplay and story. This phenomena has affected my thought process so much that I hardly ever use legendary Pokemon while playing these games, meaning most of the time they just sit in the Pokeboxes, never to be used again. The go-to meme in this regard is, of course, Arceus, the god Pokemon. It's omnipotent and omniscient, yet it just allows you to capture it so that it can spend the rest of its days chilling in the PC. It's funny given Arceus's insane power, but the sad side of it trickles down to other legendaries when you capture them. If you don't use them, the most powerful creatures in the world become enslaved. And if you do use them, there's hardly ever any justification for why they'd listen to you exclusively. It also creates a constraint on the RPG elements of the game, as the player must always be some prophet child with a heart of pure gold so that the game can justify a legendary Pokemon giving up its freedom to venture beside the person. Game Freak has never come up with a good solution to this problem, but to be fair, I'm not really sure one exists. Legendary Pokemon also create more issues within the mechanics of the games, because a lot of the time, encounters with them are quite boring and stale. I'm glad Game Freak has gotten away from the one-off battles where if the legendary dies, it's gone forever. We no longer have to save before each encounter, which is nice. I mean, I still do it, but yeah. Anyway, the problem with catching legendaries is the monotony of it. I was excited to go out and track down the legendary birds and catch them, but after fighting Zapdos for a few moments, I remembered why legendary hunting kinda sucks. Most Pokemon have pretty high catch rates, although they were decreased in this game until the player becomes the champion, and I'll never forget that infamous level 14 Goldeen that refused to be caught during my first playthrough of Pokemon Sword, but that's besides the point. Obviously though, legendary Pokemon are going to have much lower catch rates, which makes catching them an absolute chore. The idea of a battle against a legendary Pokemon is exciting, and it should provide some of the most exhilarating gameplay within each respective title. But they just don't. Every legendary encounter plays out the same way. Apply a status ailment, whittle down its health, and spam Ultra Balls until eventually you get lucky. It took me 23 minutes to catch Zapdos, and it died twice from a sandstorm. Within those 23 minutes, I was frustrated, as the series' decision to make a Pokeball shake 3 times before a successful capture worked against the game here. When the player already is suspect about their time being wasted, nothing is more upsetting than to see a Pokeball shake 3 times and bust open when the creature is at full health, and then seeing the same Pokeball bust open right away without a single shake when the creature is nearly dead. It doesn't make any sense, and only serves to inject anger into an already tedious situation. Zapdos was eventually caught, but I hardly felt excited. I just felt relieved that it was over. This feeling has been true of legendary encounters since Red and Blue, and the games have never been able to remedy this. As I continue my efforts to catch these legendary birds, I thought I'd take a minute to discuss their new Galarian forms, as it's a pretty big switch up. Zapdos, Moltres, and Articuno have had their electric, fire, and ice typings replaced with fighting, dark, and psychic respectively to accompany their still existent flying type. There's a better natural flow to these typings as fighting beats dark, dark beats psychic, and psychic beats fighting. It creates more balance, allowing each to have some sense of strength and weakness when compared to each other as a unit of legendaries. None is more powerful than both of the others. Now, that's not entirely true, because each of them has the flying type in addition to these new types, so it does create some misbalance there, but overall, I'd say it's pretty good. And the Galarian forms for these birds just look sick. And I know that's subjective, but I do think these designs are very well done. Zapdos gains the fighting type, and so landlocking it and highlighting its legs by bulking them up makes for a good fit. Moltres is perhaps the most drastic change given its black body and accompanying red and pink flame, and it now has a more sinister face. This is the hardest to recognize from its original counterpart, but it still stood out as Moltres to me. And Articuno's posture and design reflects a sense of intelligence, which you'd naturally associate with Psychic-type Pokemon. So overall, I love these designs, and if I'm honest, I kind of think they're better than the originals. So, after some annoying battles, I finally managed to capture all 3 legendary birds and return to Peony to wrap up this legendary adventure. Each of the 3 adventures gets kicked off with these dramatic title cards, and it only seems right that Peony be the one to close each case after the player is finished with them. It creates a nice checkbox setup. From here, there's only one legendary clue left to tackle. Discovering the secret of the sleeping Regis. Functionally, this quest is a lot like the Legendary Birds one, as you'll have to track down each Regi, battle it, and capture it in order to complete the trial. The difference here is that each of the hallowed grounds is locked away behind a puzzle that the player must solve in order to gain access. In my Isle of Armor video, I talked about how Game Freak should incorporate more interesting ways to track Pokemon, whether it be done narratively or through game mechanics. I even directly mentioned the way Regis were found in the 3rd generation as a point of emphasis. It's funny then that they return in the Crown Tundra. Unlike in Ruby and Sapphire, these puzzles are more spelled out for the player if they take the time to read the notes on each door. You won't need to learn Braille to open these doors. Instead, you'll just need a little bit of brain power. The clues are pretty simple, such as create a sharp pitched noise in front of the door, have a Pokemon holding a never-changing stone, and present the door with a living snowflake. These clues are worded in a smart way, as they aren't so obscure as to force most players to resort to checking the internet, but they also aren't open books that directly tell you the answer. It's not unreasonable to think that the player will realize that the first clue refers to whistling, the second clue refers to having a Pokemon holding an Everstone, and the third one refers to having a Pokemon that looks like a snowflake, in this case, Cryogonal. The third clue is perhaps the most obscure, but there's plenty of Cryogonal roaming the grass just outside the ice ruins, so it really shouldn't be a huge leap in logic. Once inside each ruin, the player will simply have to highlight all the spots on the floor and battle and catch each Regi respectively, which really isn't too exhilarating. It has the same issues as other legendaries. Those same ones I just talked about a few minutes ago also apply here. But at least the Regis are indoors, meaning weather conditions like sand and hail can't kill them. It took me about 45 minutes to hunt down and catch each of the 3 Regis, and that made me realize just how short the story bit of this DLC is. It took me about an hour and a half to wrap up the Calyrex plot, an hour for the birds, and it looked like the Regis questline would only take about an hour as well, as I neared its conclusion. So at this point, I was just hoping that there would be something more. With that, I ventured out to the final ruins found in the Crown Tundra. It's here where the player is faced with another permanent choice, akin to picking Urshifu's second typing, or which legendary horse they'd receive in the Calyrex questline. 2 new Regis have been introduced, Regieleki and Regidrago, both of whom have designs that are just alright. Depending on what pattern the player draws using the lights on the ground, they will receive one of these 2 Pokemon. And choosing one of them locks the player off from catching the other within that save file. So I've been giving these choices a lot of praise throughout these DLC videos, but I'd like to take a second to entertain the notion that financial gain is the main reason for this design choice. Game Freak already encourages the player to buy both versions of their Pokemon games by having version-exclusive Pokemon, and the same principle might also apply to these DLCs. If a player, such as myself, already has both Sword and Shield, they might feel incentivized to buy both DLCs for both games, meaning that Game Freak stands to gain double the money in some instances. To the best of my knowledge, there really isn't a major difference between Swords DLCs versus Shields DLCs, and so it feels rather shady to see each game have version-exclusive DLC. Perhaps these choices are included to encourage players to buy both versions of the DLC so that they can potentially trade over the alternate Urshifu typing as well as the Regi and legendary horse that they didn't choose for this save file. If that's the true reason for why choices were included, then players have every right to feel kinda gypped. It feels insulting to me as a player that the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra wouldn't be sold as a single product without version exclusivity, as there really isn't a reason not to do so outside of profit. But I really hope that isn't true. Anyway, I decided to go with Regidrago for my selection, mostly because I figured he'd be easier to capture given Thunder Wave could hit it, but not its counterpart. It took me a while to capture him, but once I did, I returned to Peony to wrap up this set of legendary quests. When you finish all 3, Peony's daughter Naya returns and appears ready for a nice reunion with her father, but it appears he hasn't learned much as he's immediately clingy around her once more. He presents her with a new outfit to adventure in, but she rejects it and gives it to you before departing once more for the max lair. Peony follows, and the player is shown the now standard "The End" screen, meaning they finished what's considered the main story of this DLC. Still, it's immediately obvious that there's more to do, as the player stumbles across another legendary clue to return to Peony. There's also the meeting we had earlier with Sonia, where she asked us to track down footprints, as well as to revisit the max lair. So, suffice it to say, we still have a lot to cover. Heading back to the max lair, we find Peony and Naya, and after forking over the dropped legendary clue, the head scientist reveals that Ultra Beasts have been found within the max lair. This means that the player can now randomly encounter one of the 11 Ultra Beasts within a Dynamax adventure, and if they're able to find Necrozma and capture it, they can complete this quest by talking to Peony. This involves a lot of RNG, and the game tries to throw you a bone by making it so that Naya will occasionally give you a chance to learn Necrozma's exact location in exchange for some ore, but it's really not enough. She will give you this information sometimes on Necrozma, but really on a random Pokemon each time if you give her Dynamax points, or ore points, or whatever the heck the game calls them. These ore points, I think Dynite ores is what they were called, and those points can be grinded out to receive items otherwise, or they can be traded to Naya for information. Dynamite ores? Dynite ores? Something like that. It was some weird name for them, and I can't remember. Anyway, still, even with Naya's help, asking the player to endure this much randomness in order to complete the quest really is a pain. It feels like an artificial way to inflate the DLC's runtime. But again, more on the max layers in a little bit. As a side note, I should mention that you can battle Peony here, and he has a team of 5 Pokemon instead of just 2, which is nice. What isn't nice is that this is only the second trainer battle found in the Crown Tundra, which is very disappointing to someone like me who enjoys battling against other trainers the most. However, it seems as if my luck is about to change. As we depart the max lair, we receive a call from Leon, who urges us to come to Winden Stadium for a brand new event. He's referring to what's called the Galarian Star Tournament, which can only be accessed if the player has completed the main story, the post-game story, the Isle of Armor story, and the Crown Tundra story. It's a pretty big barrier to entry, but in my opinion, it's worth experiencing, as this new tournament is a great new addition. Throughout the main story of the Crown Tundra, I hardly battled at all, and hearing about a new tournament involving a bunch of gym leaders, rivals, and even new characters was enough to pique my interest. These tournaments are set up as 2-on-2 battles where the player can pick a partner from a set roster to compete alongside of them. At first, only Hop and Marnie are available as partners, but you'll unlock more partners for each tournament you win, culminating in a full roster when you're victorious 15 times. Going along with this, it appears that your opponent's teams are somewhat randomized as well, meaning you'll see some interesting combos, like Bede and Opal teaming up, or Raihan and Leon working together. It means that each run through the tournament generally feels different from the last because each trainer's Pokemon, more specifically their chosen type, does create some different synergies depending on their partner's preference. Overall, it creates a nice little tournament that has just enough levels of variety to maintain interest and stay fun. It ended up being my personal favorite part of both DLCs. With that being said, there's a good chance that my bias towards battling has clouded my vision, as the Galarian Star Tournament does have some issues. For instance, each computer trainer, whether it be your partner or an opponent, only has 3 Pokemon, but you are not restricted to 3 yourself. This means that unless you limit yourself on purpose, each battle ends up being 9 versus 6, which is extremely unfair to your opponents. So many other battle systems limit you to 3 Pokemon, and I was stunned when this one didn't. Having a full team meant it rarely mattered how my partner performed because I always had enough reserves to get the job done. Of course, we are battling with sometimes brain-dead AI, so maybe this was the developer's way of cutting back on that frustration. Going along with this point is the fact that the Pokemon being used aren't level capped, meaning you can easily roll in with a team of 6 level 100 beefy Pokemon and just dominate everyone. It kind of makes the whole partner selection a moot point. And with this in mind, I would have liked to see the developers introduce a solo mode where you didn't choose a partner and instead you had 2 of your own Pokemon battling at once. Another complaint with the tournaments is that the other trainers will always use the same 3 Pokemon regardless of if they're on your team or they are an opponent. I really would have loved to see each trainer have access to 6 Pokemon, 3 of whom were randomly selected going into each tournament. This would have taken the variety offered here from just alright to pretty good, and would have drastically increased the tournament's replayability. With how it is now, I know which Pokemon each trainer will have, as well as the order in which they will send them out, so it isn't hard to plan accordingly and destroy them. And the only other thing that irks me, and admittingly this one is more of a minor nuisance, is that in all the tournaments I've completed so far, I've had to battle Raihan and Leon in each one. I'd like to see these 2 broken up more because facing their combo team at this point has grown completely stale. I'm writing this after going through the tournament 5 times, and while I have been enjoying it, the fatigue is starting to set in, and it's a shame. Still, I do think it was one of their better additions brought to Sword via the Crown Tundra, and it was kind of necessary given how little battling there is to do within the frozen mountainsides. There's still a few things to wrap up in the Crown Tundra, but I figured now was the best time to jump into the max layer to get a better feel for how it played. I outlined its setup earlier in this video, and now it's time to explain why this system is the worst of any introduced within the DLCs. Obviously, the big allure of the Crown Tundra is all the legendary Pokemon brought back. This theme of encountering legendaries is baked into the DNA of this DLC, from its 3 main quests all focused on capturing legendaries, and the max layer which houses legendaries, as well as Ultra Beast, which for all intensive purposes are more legendaries. It's the selling point for this expansion by far. It's not unusual for recent Pokemon games to incorporate ways for the player to obtain all the legendaries from previous generations, but the max layer has to be the worst possible method to reintroduce these Pokemon. I really like the setup in ORAS, where you could encounter legendary Pokemon in the sky by flying around on Latios or Latias. It was simple, efficient, and made completing the Pokédex relatively easy. Here, that's not the case for 2 main reasons: time consumption and randomness. These 2 components go hand in hand, but let's look at them as separate entities. First up, we have the random generation of these dungeons, including the Pokemon you're allowed to use, the Pokemon you'll encounter including the final legendary, as well as the items you'll find along the way. The movesets on each Pokemon may also be randomly selected, but it's hard for me to tell. I once had a Tentacruel with Swords Dance, but the only move on it that benefited from that was Poison Jab, so it's hard to say. The point is, you'd be pretty hard pressed to call these competitive sets. But back on topic. The sheer amount of variables ensures that not every run through the max layer is going to result in capturing the final legendary, or that you'll even encounter one that you want. The volume of randomness leads to a few moments of player empowerment, but many instances of player frustration. For example, you might fight your way to the end of a max layer only to encounter a Pokemon that you don't care about. Or you might get lucky and find a desired Pokemon only for it to beat you or blow you out of its den before you can defeat and capture it. The games don't do a great job of presenting exactly how the max raid battles work, and that inability to communicate compounds disappointment. There were some battles where I had nearly finished off the legendary only to get blown out of the den right before I could land the final blow. This happened only a few moves into the fight, which it didn't add up. In previous showdowns, I got 3 or 4 hits off before I was kicked out, but in this instance, 1 attack and I was booted. I'm not insinuating that this element is random. I'm sure there's a calculation involved that I'm simply not aware of. But without that comprehension, it feels like the game is just trying to piss you off. It feels like another layer of randomness because so much of these max layer adventures are already drowning in it. There's also the fact that if you're playing offline like me, you'll have to pray that your computer AI companions are smart enough to choose super effective moves and don't waste time applying needless buffs or weather conditions to the field. Sometimes they choose right, which simply meets our expectations of what they should do. But other times, they choose wrong, which is always infuriating. There's no sense of accomplishment to be gained, only dissatisfaction. They also never Dynamax, which results in a lesser damage output, and they will sometimes give up a type advantage to take on a new Pokemon. I shouldn't have to play with faulty AI if I don't want to cough up the money for Nintendo Online. Instead, I should be able to control all 4 Pokemon instead of just 1. Hopefully, this gives you enough examples to see how randomness hurts the experience more than it does help it. And that leads us to the second major issue with max raid battles, the time needed to collect every legendary. Right off the bat, our last adventure with Peony is about finding Necrozma, which again is left up to an RNG system to determine if he will spawn. Who knows how many rounds it would take for the player to find this Ultra Beast, actually manage to capture it, and then return to Peony to wrap things up. It could be 1 run, but it could also be 10 runs, or 50, or 100, or 1,000 because of the setup. And as that number grows, the player's time invested in the game balloons quickly without much progress being achieved. Sure, you might catch other Pokemon, or even Legendaries, but if you just want to wrap up this section of the story, good luck! The Crown Tundra is perfectly content with making you waste a lot of your precious time. A good fix for these issues would have been allowing the player to choose the type of legendary that they want to encounter, which would drastically cut down on the number of legendaries that they might find. On top of that, once a player has reached the den of a legendary, they should be able to return directly to that fight if they lose, instead of having to clear the 3 initial battles of the dungeon all over again. Giving the player these options would cut back on the insane RNG and the potential for wasted time, while also maintaining the integrity and structure of the max layer adventures. But of course, Game Freak wants you playing these games for as long as possible, and so this version of the max layers probably never existed. It's for these reasons, though, that the max layers are the least enjoyable part of the DLC for me personally. They are too content with wasting my time and having to rely on good luck to feel any sense of satisfaction and achievement. We're on the home stretch of this video now, so let's conclude by highlighting a couple of the other smaller objectives that you can complete in the Crown Tundra before I share my final thoughts on this DLC and the future of Pokemon. After you defeat either Glastrier or Spectrier, you can return to this house in Freezington to receive a level 5 Cosmog. Leveling it will result in you getting either Solgaleo or Lunala, depending on the version you're playing. It's a pretty significant gift given its status as a legendary Pokemon, but maybe it is warranted since you most likely saved the town from being leveled. Still, this is another issue with bringing back older legendaries into newer games. They lose their significance. Cosmog played a vital role in the events of Sun and Moon, and now he's just here chilling in this random lady's house, waiting for you to pick him up. It feels like the Pokemon is made lesser by being brought back into the next generation. I get why they want to do that, given the rise of competitive Pokemon and the desire to have all the Pokemon accessible in every game, haha cause it Dexit, but it does lessen the impact that they previously had. Early on in your adventure through the Crown Tundra, you'll encounter Sonia, who will introduce another side quest involving legendary Pokemon. Spread across the island, you can find the footsteps of Cobalion, Terrakion, and Verizon Wireless. I mean Virizion. At first, I had nightmares of the Diglett questline from the Isle of Armor, but luckily, things are much simpler here. Once you find out where the footprints are, they spawn in bunches, meaning they're super easy to find. After collecting 50 of them, you can return to Sonia, who will input the data into a machine. Which, I must note, Game Freak decided to hide the machine from our vision just to save time on actually having to build a model of a machine and showing us it. I hate that they keep taking these shortcuts. Anyway, once the data is processed, she tells us where we can find each of these creatures, and sure enough, they're exactly where she says. If you manage to catch all 3, you can take them to a specific part of the map, and Keldeo will spawn for you to catch as well. I wasn't compelled to engage with this questline though, because I really don't care for the designs of these things, but I'm glad they were included as another optional side objective to tackle. Speaking of legendaries, you can also get yourself a Poilpole and Regigigas in this DLC. Poilpole is attained after completing 15 max layer adventures, and Regigigas can only be attained by having all 5 other Regis in your party and traveling to a specific portion of the Giant's Bed. Of course, in order to do this, you'll have no choice but to get Nintendo Online, since you can only get one of the new Regis in the DLC. I don't like that it's locked off behind a paywall, but at least it's here. Spiritomb is also available to be caught, but encountering it is much trickier than others, as it's been hidden away. In one of the most southern points of the map, you can find this tombstone that simply reads, "Spread my message." If you talk to other trainers in the overworld a total of 32 times, Spiritomb will spawn for you to fight and catch, which is cool. 32 might seem like a strange number, but it's actually a cool Easter egg to Diamond and Pearl. 32 was the number of trainers you needed to talk to in the underground in order for Spiritomb to spawn. Also hidden away pretty well is an NPC who will give you a Galarica Wreath in exchange for 15 Galarica Twigs. Giving this item to a Galarian Slowpoke will evolve it into Galarian Slowking, which finishes off the trifecta for this set of Pokemon. And finally, there's another hidden Dynamax battle by the Great Dyna Tree. If you shake this massive tree a couple of times, a Greedent will spawn, and you'll have to take it out. It's pretty strong, and it managed to take out some of my higher level Pokemon, which was impressive. Killing it will reward the player with a ton of berries, which is cool. All of these smaller objectives aren't really a part of the main story, but they do a good job of funneling into the mysterious and legendary themes presented throughout this DLC, meaning, for the most part, I thought they were worthwhile inclusions. The Crown Tundra is now complete, and I'm surprised to say that I enjoyed it only slightly less than the Isle of Armor. Going in, I heard that it wasn't as story-driven as the previous DLC, and that had me concerned. In the end, though, there was enough here to keep me going through the roughly 7 or so hours that I spent with it. The focus is completely on the pursuit of legendaries. There's no doubt about it. All the major plot threads found here are structured around catching a legendary or a trinity of legendaries. And one of the other major additions, the max Lairs, emphasizes them as well. It's probably exactly what many players wanted, but I've never had much of an affinity for legendary Pokemon because, like I said earlier, they usually just end up in the PC after I catch them. And that's true even when they've been presented contextually by playing a role in the narrative, which is really only true of one legendary here, Calyrex. So while it was exciting to see some old faces in new places, I can't say I got much out of this DLC in this regard. With that being said, there are some things to be praised and hopeful about within the Crown Tundra. The Galarian Star Tournament provided a much-needed injection of trainer battles, which were severely lacking throughout most of this expansion. And I didn't really mention it in this video, but once again, a lot of older Pokemon have been brought into these games, which does kind of vamp up and reinvigorate the competitive scene. And finally, the wild area here is easily Game Freak's best, as their focus on portraying a single type of environment, in this case a mountainside, went a long way in this place feeling more well realized. The base game's wild area, along with the Isle of Armors to a degree, tried to include too many biomes, making things feel more artificial. The Crown Tundra is much more believable in this regard, which leads to more player immersion as they traverse its lands. There's still plenty of things to be cleaned up, but I can't deny that the team made significant progress between each iteration of the wild area concept. Final thoughts here. I can only recommend the Crown Tundra if you're a fan of catching Pokemon and hunting down legendaries. Besides that, I feel about the same way as I did in regards to the Isle of Armor. I don't think it was worth the $15 price tag, but I could recommend it for $10. My main takeaway though is that I hope in the future Game Freak will incorporate a lot of this type of storytelling and optional locations within the base game and avoid the DLC pathway altogether. The Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra do provide some interesting stories, and Sword and Shield would have been much better experiences overall if these were a part of the original package and were optional instead of being tacked on for an extra fee of $30. I can't believe I've created 5 hours worth of content relating to the 8th generation of Pokemon, considering that I think it's easily the weakest yet. These 2 DLCs, while containing some levels of merit, didn't do much to elevate my overall perspective on this generation. I'm also not overly optimistic about the Sinnoh remakes, considering part or most of the work is being offloaded to another company for production. I know I'll play those games and enjoy them, but what I'm most optimistic for is the 9th generation. If Pokemon Legends Arceus, which seems to contain an open world, ends up being a hit, we may finally see Game Freak incorporate an open world structure into a main series game. Alola felt like a fresh start for the series, but Galar quickly brought things back to the status quo. I'd love to see Game Freak pick up where they left off with Generation 7 by continuing to mix things up and provide different experiences. For example, start the game in a crazy biome that doesn't have its own versions of Pidgey or Rattata, or include a difficulty option so that players can modify their experience, or, like I've been hoping for, include open world elements, or just do something crazy and different that gives us another fresh experience. That's my biggest hope for Pokemon moving forward. I'll continue to buy all the games, but the 8th generation of Pokemon was certainly the first where I've noticed series fatigue. I think it's time for Pokemon to reinvent itself a little bit, and I look forward to where the series will go in the future. Well, there you have it. I've now created a 3-hour video on Pokemon Sword, an hour-long look at the Isle of Armor, and an hour-long look at the Crown Tundra. I really hope you found some enjoyment from these videos, and I hope you'll reward the tremendous amount of time and work that went into these by leaving a like and subscribing. If these videos continue to gain traction, I'd have no problem covering other Pokemon games, like Pokemon Snap, the Sinnoh remakes, and Pokemon Legends Arceus. Regardless, if you watched all 3 of these videos, I thank you sincerely. I know how busy my life is, and having someone dedicate 5 hours of their time to watching this series carries a lot of weight to me. It means a lot, and so I thank you. If you do have any comments, questions, corrections, or concerns, be sure to leave a comment and let me know what you're thinking. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Very important also, follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. And as always, have a nice day and take care.